The next morning, I started early. The air smelled of dew and wild grass, and the horizon burned with pink and orange streaks. I walked my property line, clipboard in hand, pretending to take measurements, but really, I was just imagining Karen's reaction when she realized she couldn't stroll through my gate like it was a sidewalk. I had been a rancher for decades, and in all that time, I had learned one thing. Respect isn't demanded, it's owned. And Karen? She had not owned an inch. Her idea of authority was stamp papers and clipboard inspections. My idea of authority was years of blood, sweat, and mud on this land. By mid-morning, I had my plan in full detail. I sketched out a line of steel bollards, each 5 feet tall, planted deep into the ground. They would be formidable, elegant in a rugged sort of way, like sentries guarding the perimeter. No gap large enough for her heels to tip through, no lock she could claim didn't meet HOA standards. Every bolt, every weld would scream, "Do not enter." I drove into town to source the materials, dragging my old truck behind me like a stubborn mule. The hardware store clerk gave me a look that said, "Whoa, that's a lot of steel." I smiled wryly. "It's for security," I said vaguely. They didn't need to know it was specifically for Karen. Back at the ranch, I enlisted the help of my nephew, Mike. "You ready to make history?" I asked. Mike raised an eyebrow, a little nervous but mostly excited. "History against HOA tyranny," he said. That was a spirit. We unloaded the steel like soldiers arming for battle. By afternoon, the first bollard was in the ground. Solid, immovable. I stepped back and imagined Karen arriving, clipboard in hand, expecting to waltz through the gate. I could practically hear her indignant gasp when she realized she couldn't. That mental image made every drop of sweat worth it. It didn't take long for her to notice. Around 5 p.m., I saw her car slow down at the edge of the property. She squinted through the windshield, probably thinking she had arrived at some sort of public easement. When she realized the steel pillars blocked the path, her mouth dropped open, and for a moment, she looked like she had been caught in a trap. Then, as if on cue, she stormed toward the gate, her clipboard bouncing with indignation. "What is this?" she shouted, flinging her arms. "You can't just... This isn't legal. The HOA..." I leaned on the nearest bollard, letting her fury wash over me like a summer storm. "Oh, I think it is," I said calmly. "These bollards meet every structural code there is, and they are on my property." Karen looked as though she might faint. She stomped her foot, trying to find a weak spot, testing the steel with the strength of someone used to issuing warnings rather than actually lifting things. Mike and I exchanged a glance. She didn't stand a chance. But then, Karen did what she always did. She dug for loopholes. She pointed to the edge of the gate, squinting. "The HOA might, we could," she muttered, trailing off. She looked ridiculous, like a mouse attempting to roar at a lion. By the time she drove off in a cloud of dust, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The bollards were more than just physical barriers. They were a statement. She would come back. She always did. And when she did, she would find that I was ready. That night, I sat on the porch with a cold drink, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The ranch was quiet. The cattle settled in the pastures, and the wind carried the faint scent of hay. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. For once, the land felt entirely mine. Not just because it was legally mine, but because no one, not even an overzealous HOA Karen, could dictate how I treated it. I didn't know it then, but this small act of defiance would trigger a chain reaction. Emails would fly, neighbors would take sides, and Karen would escalate her tactics in ways that I couldn't have imagined. But for now, with the steel bollards standing tall like silent sentries, I allowed myself to savor the victory. Victory, however, was always temporary. And Karen, I realized, was a force that didn't recognize limits. The morning after the bollard went in, I expected some reprieve, maybe even a grudging respect from Karen. Instead, the first thing I saw when I checked my mailbox was a letter with the HOA logo stamped in ominous red. My heart sank a little, but only for a second. Then I laughed. The letter was the HOA equivalent of a battle cry. It cited and authorized modifications to a community access point, potential safety hazards, and my personal favorite, failure to comply with HOA aesthetic standards. In other words, we see your bollards, and we don't like them. I read it aloud to Mike, who was leaning against the kitchen counter munching on a leftover sandwich. You realize she's going to make this a personal vendetta now, I said. Mike nodded, smearing mustard across his cheek. Yeah, and she'll probably schedule a formal inspection next week. I sighed. Then we'll just be ready for her. Karen didn't waste time. That very afternoon, she appeared at the edge of the property again, this time armed with not just a clipboard, but a small army of HOA volunteers. There were 3 of them, all clutching measuring tapes and clipboards like weapons. They looked confused, probably expecting to stroll through my gate and find a neat little garden plot. Instead, they were met with the silent steel sentries I had installed. Karen's expression was priceless. First came disbelief, then indignation, then fury, the full spectrum. She stumped forward, pointing at the bollards like a general directing artillery. You can't just do this. These are community standards. They are on my property, I said evenly. You're welcome to take measurements, but you won't be passing. The volunteers hesitated, glancing at each other nervously. One of them, a young man who looked like he had barely graduated high school, whispered, maybe we should just call the office. Karen waved him off like a minor annoyance. She circled the bollards like a predator. This is an ISO. This is illegal. The HOA will. Will what? I interrupted, leaning casually against the gate post. Call the sheriff? Write another letter? Make another passive-aggressive post on the community forum? Karen's face turned an interesting shade of red, somewhere between tomato and fire truck. You will remove these immediately, she barked. I shook my head. Not happening. That's when the mental chess game began. Karen wasn't just angry, she was plotting. I could see it in the way she took out her phone, presumably to email the HOA board, summon inspectors, and draft multiple complaints simultaneously. The volunteers looked like deer caught in headlights, but Karen was on a mission. Over the next few days, the emails started rolling in. At first, they were polite, almost cordial. We'd like to discuss recent modifications to your property. Then they got progressively nastier. Your failure to comply with HOA regulations is noted and will be escalated. And finally, the pièce de résistance, immediate removal of unauthorized structures is required, or legal action will be taken. I read each one aloud to Mike, who laughed so hard he nearly choked on his soda. She's losing it, he said. You've basically triggered Karen 2.0. Karen 2.0, I repeated, grinning. I like that, but we're not backing down. Not a chance. I decided to take proactive measures. If Karen was going to escalate, then I would be ready. I reinforced the bollards, pouring concrete into each base, welding additional braces, and even adding a small decorative chain across the top, not just for aesthetics, but as an extra physical and symbolic barrier. Every detail was designed to make her trespass attempts futile. Meanwhile, word about the bollard spread through the neighborhood. Some neighbors came by to see the spectacle, curious and entertained. Most whispered their support, admiring the audacity. One older gentleman shook his head solemnly. Don't underestimate her, he warned. HOA Karens don't quit easily. I knew he was right. Karen had a reputation for relentless pursuit of rules enforcement, and she thrived on conflict. But that made the challenge all the more entertaining. The next morning, I awoke to a strange sight, a flyer posted on my gate. Printed in bold letters, HOA complaint, unsafe structures, remove immediately. Beneath it was Karen's signature scrawl and an ominous stamp. Failure to comply will result in escalation. Mike snorted. She's using paper now? What is this, the 1800s? I smiled. No, she's trying to intimidate us. Classic Karen move. We tore the flyer down and framed it on the wall of the barn instead. It became a kind of trophy, a reminder that we had won the first round, physically at least. But the psychological warfare had begun. Karen wasn't just going to leave it at letters and flyers. I could feel it in my bones. She was planning her next move, something more elaborate. True to form, the escalation arrived the following week. While I was out checking the fences, I noticed a small group of HOA members lurking near the property line. They weren't trespassing yet, but they were observing, taking notes, whispering to each other. Karen herself crouched behind a tree, binoculars in hand, surveying the bollards as though they were a military installation. I waved casually. She waved back, a cold, calculated wave that somehow carried all the fury of her personality. It was a silent standoff. That night, I realized something. This wasn't just about a gate anymore. It had evolved into a full-blown saga, a battle of wills, wit, and determination. Karen was an unstoppable force of bureaucracy and obsession, and I was a stubborn rancher unwilling to yield. As I sipped my coffee, staring at the steel pillars glinting in the sunrise, I felt a thrill. Every action she took, every email or flyer, only strengthened my resolve. I wasn't just protecting a gate. I was defending my territory, my principles, and the unspoken law of property rights that, to me, mattered far more than HOA bylaws. Little did I know, Karen had already drafted her next move, something subtle, cunning, and infuriatingly bureaucratic. She wasn't going to just storm the gate. She was going to try to break me in ways I hadn't anticipated, and that would set the stage for the real showdown. But for now, the ranch was peaceful. The bollards stood tall, the cattle grazed lazily, and I felt untouchable. For the moment, it was a quiet Thursday morning when the first sign of Karen's next level of obsession appeared. I was sipping my coffee on the porch, watching the cattle graze, when I noticed something peculiar, a small, white drone hovering near the edge of the property. It bobbed in the air, swiveling like it was conducting a very serious inspection. Mike, standing behind me, squinted. "Is that a drone?" he whispered. "She brought a drone." I grinned. "Oh, she brought a drone." Karen had clearly decided that if she couldn't physically get past the bollards, she'd use technology to assert her authority. The drone circled my gate, descending and ascending in calculated patterns. Its tiny camera pointed at every inch of steel I had painstakingly installed. I could almost hear her muttering into a headset. "Unbelievable," I said. "She's gone full surveillance mode." That wasn't all. By noon, a colorful parade of HOA notices appeared along the edge of my property. Flyers stapled to trees, laminated warnings stuck to fence posts, even a tiny banner hanging from a neighboring property. An authorized modification. Remove immediately. It looked like a bizarre art installation of bureaucratic obsession. Mike laughed so hard he nearly dropped his hammer. "This is insane. It's like she's waging a one-woman war." I nodded. A war she started. Over the next few days, Karen escalated further. The drone returned, now accompanied by a squad of volunteers armed with clipboards, measuring wheels, and remarkably judgmental expressions. They positioned themselves at strategic points along the property line, whispering and scribbling notes while pretending to inspect the perimeter. Karen herself remained elusive, often hiding behind trees or peeking from her car, binoculars in hand. She had turned this into a full-scale covert operation. I called it Operation Karen. But I was ready. Each morning, I walked the gate and the bollards, checking for weaknesses. I reinforced the chains, double-checked the concrete bases, and even installed small reflective markers to deter late-night intrusions. I felt like a general preparing for a siege. Then came the day she tried a more audacious approach. I was out in the pasture when I heard a strange rattling noise near the gate. I turned just in time to see Karen attempting to crawl under the bollards. Yes, crawl. In heels. Mike appeared beside me, nearly choking on his laugh. "She's what?" "Under the bollards," I said, my jaw tightening. "She's actually trying to get through them." Karen froze halfway under a bollard, stuck in a position that looked both humiliating and desperate. I raised a hand and called out, "Need a hand?" Her eyes blazed with fury. "This is harassment," she yelled. "You can't. This is illegal." I shrugged. "Nope. Private property. Bollards. You lose." Finally, she extricated herself with dignity, or as much dignity as one can muster while crawling through dirt in a blouse and skirt. She stormed back to her car, muttering threats and waving her clipboard. I caught Mike muttering, "She's losing it." And she was. Karen had exhausted every direct approach, every bureaucratic trick she could muster. That meant it was time for subtler strategies, psychological warfare. Flyer became more aggressive, emails more venomous, and her personal visit were replaced with what I can only describe as passive-aggressive standoffs. One morning, I discovered something new. Tiny holes had been dug near the edges of my property. I inspected them carefully. They weren't deep enough to cause any real damage, but it was clear someone had been planning a sneaky entrance. I didn't need to guess who. Mike whistled. She's turning into a full-on cartoon villain. I smiled. Good. That means we're winning. I decided it was time to respond in kind. I added decorative spikes to the tops of the bollards. Not sharp, mind you, just enough to make it look intimidating. I hung small mirrors on chains, so anyone approaching would see themselves reflected 100 times. It became both a deterrent and a spectacle. When the drone returned the next day, I was ready. I had set up reflective surfaces and motion sensors that triggered small, harmless alarms. The drone's camera captured the chaos, flashing lights, bouncing reflections, and 2 humans laughing uncontrollably from the porch. I could almost hear Karen screaming through the video feed. The neighbors were loving it. Some came by to watch the spectacle, bringing coffee and snacks. It had become a neighborhood entertainment event. The Karen Show, starring the unstoppable HOA agent versus the unflappable rancher and his trusty nephew. But Karen wasn't finished. Her emails grew increasingly absurd. One demanded that I submit a detailed schematic of my bollard installation, including the depth of concrete, type of steel, and angle of placement. Another suggested that the improper use of decorative chains violated HOA bylaws. By now, it was clear she was documenting everything, preparing for some bureaucratic victory. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Each ridiculous demand only fueled my amusement and determination. It was no longer about just keeping her out physically. It was about outsmarting her every move. And that's when the idea hit me. If Karen was going to wage psychological warfare, I would turn it into performance art. I began adding humorous elements to the gate. Small flags, signs reading "Beware of Karen," and even a cardboard cutout of an HOA officer posted mockingly at the edge of the property. It was absurd, ridiculous, and completely effective. Every time she returned, she looked at it, scowled, and flounced away. By the end of the week, Karen had escalated to full-blown obsession. I could see it in the way she drove past the property at dawn, late at night, and in the middle of the afternoon. She documented everything, filed complaints constantly, and attempted increasingly creative approaches to bypass the bollards. But here's the thing. Every attempt she made only strengthened my position. Each drone flight, each hole in the dirt, each clipboard inspection became an opportunity to outmaneuver her, to turn her tactics into a spectacle, and to assert control over my property in a way that was both legal and entertaining. By the time the sun set that Friday, I sat on the porch, Mike at my side, sipping a celebratory beer. The ranch was quiet, the cattle were grazing, and the steel bollards glinted in the golden light. I realized something important. Karen wasn't going to stop, but neither was I. In fact, the more she tried, the more creative we became. Every intrusion attempt was met with clever countermeasures, humor, and strategy. And as I watched the horizon glow orange and pink, I knew one thing for certain. The war for the gate was far from over. But I was ready for her next move. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a truck horn blaring across the pasture. At first, I thought it was just a delivery or someone checking on the cattle. But when I stepped onto the porch, I realized the commotion was something far more organized and, admittedly, a little unnerving. A small convoy of HOA vehicles had lined up along the edge of the property. Karen was there, naturally, clipboard in hand, directing parade of volunteers and what appeared to be a local inspector. It looked like a full-scale siege, with Karen as a commander, barking orders like she was in a military campaign. Mike nearly dropped his coffee. Wow, she really doesn't know when to quit, does she? Nope, I said, smirking, and that's why this is going to be fun. I knew I couldn't handle this alone. The situation had gone beyond just a personal feud. It was a public spectacle, and some of the neighbors had already started taking notice. If I played this right, I could turn the tide in my favor. I walked down to the edge of the property, waving casually. A few curious neighbors peeked over their fences, some whispering, others shaking their heads in disbelief. I raised a hand. Morning, everyone. Enjoying the HOA parade. There were laughs, smiles, and even some applause. Word of Karen's antics had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, and I realized I had an audience, and potentially allies. A neighbor named Carol, who lived a few houses down, approached. "We've been watching this spectacle," she said, trying to keep a straight face. "And honestly, we're all a little tired of Karen's drama. If you want, we're willing to help monitor the gate. Just don't let her intimidate you." I grinned. Perfect. Let's make this interesting. Meanwhile, Karen had moved into full siege mode. The volunteers were measuring, taking notes, and even snapping photos of the bollards as if documenting evidence of some HOA tribunal. Karen herself paced like a caged tiger, muttering to her clipboard and occasionally yelling at anyone who dared approach her. I decided it was time to escalate too. Using my neighbors as allies, I set up small observation posts along the perimeter, each one discreetly equipped with binoculars and cameras. Any attempt by Karen or her volunteers to bypass the bollards would be documented, not just for legal purposes, but for the sheer enjoyment of seeing their reactions when they realized how futile their efforts were. By mid-afternoon, Karen's frustration had reached a boiling point. She attempted a new strategy, distraction. While a few volunteers continued to measure the gate, she approached a side path, hoping to find a weak point. I saw her move from my porch and calmly pointed a small, harmless motion-activated sprinkler toward the path. The sudden burst of water startled her, and she jumped back with a shriek that had the neighbors snickering behind their fences. "You know," I called out, "the gate works both ways. It keeps cattle in and drama out." Karen glared, dripping wet and furious, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she huddled with her volunteers, whispering intensely. I could see the scheming forming, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she tried something even more audacious. Sure enough, the next day, she launched what I can only describe as a great HOA siege. Armed with clipboards, measuring tapes, and an absurd number of forms, she attempted to overwhelm the gate with sheer bureaucracy. Every volunteer had a checklist. Every checklist had sub-checklists, and every sub-checklist was followed by a demand for documentation. They moved like a slow, clumsy army, trying to enforce rules that seemed almost tailor-made to annoy anyone with common sense. Mike and I watched from the porch, shaking our heads in disbelief. "It's like watching ants try to move a boulder," he muttered. "It's more like watching a soap opera," I replied. Neighbors gathered, some cheering quietly, others recording videos on their phones. The spectacle had become a communal event. HOA Karen versus the steel bollards, with the rancher and his allies orchestrating every move. Karen, however, was nothing if not persistent. After hours of fruitless attempts to measure, document, and threaten, she decided to go for a psychological tactic, intimidation through documentation overload. She started filing formal complaints, emails, and letters in rapid succession, hoping that the sheer volume would force me to relent. I laughed when I saw the first stack, then the second. By the fifth, I realized she had essentially created a paper mountain in my mailbox. Mike quipped, "Pretty sure she's just sending her soul at this point." Rather than panic, I decided to play along, but on my terms. I started responding with absurdly detailed reports, diagrams of the bollards, impact studies showing how they perfectly align with local feng shui principles, and even an illustrated map of the Karen observation zone where she could stand without trespassing. Each document was filled with humor and subtle digs, enough to frustrate her while remaining technically compliant with any regulations. The effect was immediate. Karen read each submission with growing disbelief, muttering under her breath about non-compliance and mockery of HOA authority. The neighbors loved it. Videos of her flustered reactions circulated in the local community group, earning comments like, "Karen versus steel bollards, the epic saga, and I've never seen bureaucracy look so ridiculous." By the end of the week, Karen had escalated to new extremes. She tried using a ladder to peer over the bollards, attempted to measure angles through the fence gaps, and even suggested that the gate's aesthetic impact violated neighborhood harmony. Each attempt was meticulously documented by me, Mike, and our growing army of supportive neighbors. I realized something crucial during this ordeal. Karen's obsession had become predictable. Every escalation followed a pattern, Every tactic repeated in slightly altered forms, and every attempt could be countered with preparation and humor. The Bollards had become more than a barrier. They were a symbol of ingenuity, resistance, and community solidarity. As I sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The war wasn't over, but we had won a significant victory. Karen had been outmaneuvered at every turn, humiliated subtly, and even forced to involve herself in a neighborhood spectacle she hadn't anticipated. Mike raised his beer in a toast. To steel, strategy, and patience, he said. I clinked my bottle against his. And to Karen, I added with a grin, may her clipboard never rest. The ranch was quiet. The bollards gleamed in the fading light, and the neighbors had gone home, satisfied with the show they had witnessed. For now, at least, peace had returned to the property. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't last. Karen was relentless, inventive, and slightly unhinged in the way only a self-appointed HOA enforcer could be. She would return with new schemes, new tactics, and probably more paperwork. And when she did, we would be ready, because the battle for the gate had evolved into a war of wills, creativity, and cunning, and I had no intention of losing. The morning started quietly, almost deceptively so. The cattle grazed peacefully, the sun stretched across the pasture, and I felt a brief sense of calm. That was, of course, before the horn sounded. This time, it wasn't a single truck or drone. It was a convoy, HOA vehicles, volunteer cars, and even what appeared to be a rented trailer crammed full of measuring tools, clipboards, and binders. And at the front of the line, of course, Karen herself, her sun hat tilted at a dramatic angle, binoculars dangling around her neck like an exclamation mark. Brace yourself, I said to Mike, who was already strapping on gloves and surveying the gate like a general preparing for battle. She's gone nuclear. Karen's latest strategy was something I had only read about in obscure HOA horror stories. She wasn't just trying to trespass physically or overwhelm me with paperwork. No, this time she had decided to stage a full-scale audit, complete with volunteers posing as inspectors, a checklist longer than a novel, and a plan to document every inch of the bollards of what she claimed was community safety compliance. The volunteers spread out like ants on a mission, measuring distances, snapping photos, and muttering to each other about nonconformance. Karen herself hovered nearby, clipboard in hand, tapping her pen like a metronome of fury. I watched from the porch, sipping coffee and smiling. Mike, I said, it's time for Operation Bollard Plus. Mike grinned. You mean, make it even more ridiculous? Exactly. We spent the next hour implementing our countermeasures. Motion-activated sprinklers, reflective surfaces, humorous signs, and even strategically placed rubber snakes to startle unsuspecting volunteers. Every step was designed to be safe, legal, and, most importantly, irritating to Karen's sense of control. By mid-morning, Karen had reached the gate. She squinted at the bollards, her expression a mixture of disbelief and horror. The reflective chain sparkled in the sun. The "Beware of Karen" sign flapped mockingly in the breeze, and a rubber snake dangled from one of the posts. The volunteers froze, cameras raised, and Karen scowled. "This is unacceptable," she shouted. "You can't just... This is harassment. Non-compliance." I leaned on a bollard, perfectly calm. Nope, just property management. Karen's next tactic was audacious, even for her. She tried to physically block the driveway, parking her car at a slight angle and attempting to use a vehicle as a pseudo-gate inspector. She called it tactical observation, but it looked more like a toddler's play attempt at authority. Mike and I barely contained our laughter. "She really thinks she's clever," Mike muttered. I walked over casually. "Karen," I said, "you do realize the gate works both ways, right? The bollards are here to keep people out, not to provide entertainment." Her glare could have melted steel. "This is illegal. I will escalate. The HOA will." But it was too late. The neighbors had caught wind of the chaos and were gathering along the property line, cameras rolling, kids pointing, and a few brave adults quietly cheering. The entire event had turned into a spectacle, Karen's most elaborate attempt to assert authority versus my ingenuity and the ridiculousness of the situation. By noon, Karen's attempt became almost cartoonish. She tried measuring from above, using a ladder and binoculars. She attempted to document angles from different perspectives. She even suggested that the decorative chains were tripping hazards, despite the fact that they were perfectly visible and attached to posts. Every move she made was recorded by neighbors, and the footage looked like a cross between a nature documentary and a comedy sketch. But Karen wasn't giving up. By the afternoon, she had deployed what I can only describe as a bureaucratic equivalent of a battering ram, a binder labeled HOA Compliance Emergency Protocol, Bollard Escalation. She flipped through pages dramatically, reading aloud sections about unauthorized modifications and visual disharmony with community standards. Mike and I exchanged a glance. "We need a counter," I whispered. Our plan was simple: turn her ridiculous strategy into an even bigger spectacle. I printed out my own Bollard defense report, complete with exaggerated diagrams, comically detailed schematics, and an official-looking stamp that read, "Approved by Ranch Authority." We laid it out on a table in the sun, visible to anyone watching. When Karen attempted to approach the gate again, I handed her the document. "All your concerns have been addressed," I said cheerfully. "Here's your compliance report." She read it, her face twisting with confusion. This is, "You can't." "I can," I said, and I did. By late afternoon, Karen had resorted to attempting to intimidate volunteers into taking stronger action, issuing increasingly absurd instructions that involved checking imaginary bylaws, measuring angles no one could possibly care about, and calling for hypothetical inspections. Each attempt was countered with neighbor observations, harmless countermeasures, and, of course, humor. By evening, she gave one last dramatic stomp, muttered something about escalation to the HOA board, and drove off in a huff. The convoy of vehicles followed, leaving the ranch quiet once more. Mike and I collapsed on the porch, laughing. "She really thought she could outmaneuver steel and humor," Mike said. "Apparently not," I replied. "And I'm not just defending a gate anymore. I'm defending dignity, sanity, and entertainment value." As the sun set, I realized something important. Karen's obsession had peaked. She had gone to extremes I didn't think were possible: drones, volunteers, ladders, rubber snakes, binders, and more. And yet, every attempt only highlighted her absurdity and strengthened my resolve. The steel bollards weren't just barriers. They were statements of cleverness, resilience, and humor. Every reflective chain, motion-activated sprinkler, and neighbor-supported countermeasure was a reminder: you can't bully ingenuity, especially when it comes with a side of satire. As we sipped cold drinks and watched the last glow of sunset, Mike clinked his bottle against mine. "To bollards, battle, and bureaucracy," he said. "And to Karen," I added with a smirk, "may she forever be foiled by steel and common sense." For the first time, I felt confident. The war had reached its peak, and though Karen might return with even more absurd strategies, we had won a psychological victory. Steel, humor, and community support had combined to create an impenetrable fortress, and, frankly, a story worth telling for years. But I knew, deep down, that the final act had yet to come. Karen was relentless, and one day she might attempt her boldest tactic yet. And when that day came, I would be ready. The week after Karen's great HOA siege was the quietest we had seen in months. I thought perhaps she had finally given up, exhausted by her own overzealous efforts. The ranch was peaceful. The cattle grazed lazily. The sun painted the fields golden, and the steel bollards gleamed like silent sentries, standing guard over the property. I even allowed myself a small sense of triumph. "Maybe it's over," I said to Mike as we sipped morning coffee on the porch. "Maybe Karen finally realized she can't win." Mike smirked. "Or maybe she's just plotting something bigger." I laughed. "Let's hope not." But as the sun reached its zenith that afternoon, my phone buzzed. An email from the HOA. I didn't even need to open it to know what it would say. And I was right. It was a notice of final escalation. Karen had apparently convinced the HOA board that my steel barricade installation was a violation of community rules so severe it required an official site visit, with legal representation. I chuckled. Looks like she's rolling out the big guns. Mike's eyes widened. "Do you think they're serious?" "Does it matter?" I replied, We're ready. By the next morning, a caravan of HOA vehicles, lawyers, and what I can only describe as Karen in her full tactical regalia arrived at the gate. Karen's clipboard was now adorned with dozens of sticky notes, pens dangling like ceremonial weapons, and an infamous sun hat tilted at an angle so sharp it could cut glass. "Rancher," she shouted the moment she saw me, her voice echoing across the pasture. "This ends today. The Bollards will come down, or legal action will be taken." I stepped forward, hands in pockets, a calm smile on my face. "Karen," I said, "we've already been through this. The Bollards are perfectly legal, safe, and aesthetically pleasing. They are staying." Her glare could have melted steel. "You think you're clever, but this is not a joke. We brought experts." I looked over the group. Most of them were volunteers who clearly had little idea what they were doing. 2 lawyers shuffled papers nervously, while Karen barked instructions like a drill sergeant. "Measure every inch. Note every deviation. Document the decorative chains." Mike whispered, "This is absurd even by Karen standards." I smirked, which is why it's perfect. Karen advanced toward the gate, pointing at each bollard as though accusing them of a crime. One of the lawyers hesitated. Technically, they appear structurally sound," he murmured. Karen snapped at him, but I could see the doubt forming in the minds of the entire party. I decided it was time to end this, once and for all, but with flair. I walked over to the gate, clapped my hands, and motioned to Mike. He activated the final countermeasure, a small, harmless fog machine I had hidden behind the bollards. Within seconds, a thick, swirling mist enveloped the area, reflecting sunlight, sparkling slightly in the golden afternoon. Karen gasped. The volunteers froze. Even the lawyers looked perplexed. What is this?" Karen demanded. "It's a protective barrier," I said solemnly, "for aesthetics and, of course, security." Mike held up a hand mirror so the sunlight bounced off it into the fog, creating dazzling rays across the gate. It looked like a stage effect from a theater production. The neighbors who had gathered along the fence line erupted into applause, laughing and filming everything. Karen's jaw dropped. She stepped back, momentarily flustered. She tried to regain composure, but her clipboard had slipped into the fog, and one volunteer accidentally tripped over a decorative chain. Chaos ensued. I seized the moment. "Karen," I said, "the bollards are perfectly compliant. They are strong, durable, and safe. You've inspected them, measured them, documented them, and yet here you are, still unable to bypass them. Perhaps it's time to accept the reality. They are not going anywhere." Karen's face twisted into a mix of fury and disbelief. She opened her mouth, probably to issue another ultimatum, but the fog machine emitted a final puff of mist, and her words were swallowed by the haze. She stomped her feet, flailing, and finally shouted, We will escalate further," before turning and storming toward her car. The lawyers whispered to each other, clearly questioning the sanity of this escalation. The volunteers shuffled away, defeated and bewildered. Even the HOA board members who had come along looked like they had walked into a surreal dream. I watched Karen drive off, her sun hat tilted dramatically, a plume of dust marking her retreat. For the first time in months, I felt the tension lift from the ranch. Mike clapped me on the back. "Well, that was spectacular." I laughed. "It's done. The Bollards have won." That evening, I walked among the steel posts, feeling a strange sense of pride. They weren't just physical barriers. They were symbols of resilience, creativity, and the ability to outsmart absurd bureaucracy. The entire neighborhood had watched the saga unfold, and the story of Karen versus the ranch gate had become a local legend. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate us, bringing cookies, lemonade, and even a few funny signs poking fun at Karen's obsession. One elderly neighbor said, "You didn't just defend your property, you entertained half the town." I nodded. "And sometimes," I said, "entertainment is half the battle." By the next week, life at the ranch returned to its normal rhythm. The cattle grazed, the sun rose and set, and the steel bollards stood silently in the golden light, gleaming like guardians of a peaceful domain. Karen didn't return, at least not for months. The HOA sent the occasional passive-aggressive email, but nothing like a previous frenzy. Mike and I would often sit on the porch, sipping drinks and laughing about the antics. "You know," he said one evening, "I don't think anyone will ever believe this story. It's too crazy." "Maybe not," I said, smiling, "but it's ours, and that's what matters." The ranch had won, not just against Karen, but against absurdity, overreach, and relentless obsession. The Bollards had become more than metal. They were a testament to standing your ground, using humor and creativity, and rallying your community in the most unexpected ways. As I watched the sunset that night, I realized something important. Battles like these aren't just about property. They're about resilience, strategy, and the occasional flair for drama. And in the end, even the most determined HOA tyrant can be outsmarted, especially when steel, humor, and a little creativity are on your side. And somewhere, far away, Karen probably sat at her desk, plotting her next move, unaware that the true victory had already been claimed. The ranch gate, and everything it represented, was untouchable.